capitalism, and he's trying to get some of the SJW stuff out of the schools. I just saw a tweet by him a day or two ago. So on that front, and again, I don't know a ton about him, that all sounds good to me.
The sonic betting there of the dumbest man on the internet, Dave Rubin. We're about to meet basically the just intellectual, moral, every way opposite of Dave Rubin. Jeff Halper. He is the head of Israelis Against Home Demolitions.
The Israeli Committee.
Excuse me,
House Demolitions.
The Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. I apologize. Jeff, you've been working on a variety of issues, both for democracy and justice in Israel and Palestine, but you also have an analysis that goes deeper than most of the sort of conversations that we have about Israel-Palestine, in my estimation. But how did you, I mean, you live in Israel. Yes. You're, a Jewish gentleman. Your mishpachah is I'm half of, and Phil is all of. This is a couple of goyim right here, so if we can.
In Israel.
Your uncle converted and lived in Israel?
Yeah, my uncle is
he should be on a watch list.
Looking guy who converted to Judaism, very rare thing.
He should. What did you say? He was a what guy?
He's a very waspy looking guy.
Right,
who converted to Judaism.
Yeah, no, I've heard that they are actually really funny stories. That's good post game content. How did you end up in Israel? How did this Israel story begin? And then how did you find yourself in the peace movement?
Well, I grew up in northern Minnesota.
Right.
A little town in northern Minnesota, and I was very active in the 60s.
Okay.
Civil rights movement, anti-war movement, Chicago in 68, all of that. I was the class of 68.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And when the 60s collapsed, we had Nixon and everything else, there was nothing for me in this country. I felt everything was, maybe this is a Midwestern reaction. Had I grown up in New York, it might have been different, where there's a little more substance. But in the Midwest,
oh, there's no substance here. Trust me.
All right. Well, even the Midwest, the Midwest is
I
flatter.
love it, but New York is trash. Yeah, I mean,
well, the Midwest is flatter.
Trash. Yeah.
So if you want, I still wanted to be involved, but I wanted to be in our language in those days to move to another front, a more meaningful front of the revolution.
Right.
And so I had to go somewhere if I wanted to get out where I could be politically active. And Israel, I mean, for reasons that aren't good, because as a Jew, I had the right to go to Israel automatically, whereas Palestinians are kind of excluded from the country automatically.
Right.
Nevertheless, I used that privilege to move there. So from the very beginning, I was involved in the Israeli peace movement. I met my wife in the new Israeli New Left in those days, and I've been involved for 45 years now.
So that's very interesting to me. So you didn't, because I think some people, and I think particularly, generationally, I'm very mindful of this. Some people definitely had a perception, I think, in the 60s and 70s who had really good politics that, obviously the Jews are incredibly, to say the least, historically repressed and literally genocided people. And there's an image of Israel of, it's kibbutz socialism and we're building something new. And some people had that vision. That was a flawed vision, but did you went in already with a sense of some of the problems in the Israeli project?
Yeah, I mean, my story isn't one of a rosy-eyed Zionist that goes in and gets disillusioned and finds his way to the left. I knew there was occupation. I knew Palestinians. I knew Zionism and so on. I do have to admit that, part of the 60s was a kind of identity politics.
Right.
Where, you had Alex Haley's roots, and you had the Native American movement, and you had, Cesar Chavez, and so on. So there was a going back to roots, and I'm not religious in any way, and the Jewish community didn't offer very much. And so in a way, there was a certain attraction to Israel, but also Israel was a different country in those days. It had a socialist government, and nobody thought that the occupation was going to last. So in a sense, going into a new country with some promise, but with some fundamental problems, being committed to trying to resolve those problems, finding a common denominator with the Palestinians, it made sense in those days. I mean, it's not like in Israel today, where I think someone like me would never even visit, let alone move there.
How did I will just say parenthetically, I spent I was in Jerusalem for under a week, and I also spent some time in the West Bank. But I would just say, and this is even, I would say, even well short of a radical critique, for people in the United States who are part of the kind of, I would just even say, modern Democratic Party, with their expectation sets, their correct expectation sets about certain sort of basic anti-racism, you would be shocked by spending time in Israel, even just by that sort of very limited metric. I mean, it really is a radically different thing. So can you, though, trace for us, because I think it's actually, I like that, though, because, okay, on one hand, there's this rosy-eyed history, and some people even hold this other narrative that Israel was this great, incredible thing, and then it was corrupted by Likud and Netanyahu, and of course that isn't true. No. But then conversely, the other narrative that Israel was always just, all it ever is was just this settler right-wing thing. Yeah. It was a settler thing, but there was complexities to, you know, a labor socialist government, then the rise of the sort of neoliberals, then you even have Ehud Barak in a third way, and then a forerunner of this sort of resurgent far right that we see across the Western Hemisphere, starting when Netanyahu came back to power in 2008. So can you talk to us just about those kind of big periods of broader Israeli political history that you have seen?
Well, yes and no, because in fact, I mean, if you look at the last 125 years of Zionism, it was a settler colonial movement.
Well, that's objectively true.
I mean, you can't,
yes,
you can't get away from that.
Right.
And they were more liberal settler colonialists, and they were more conservative, more religious, and more secular. But that was, you know, in other words, the Zionist movement, that was a left socialist nationalist movement in the turn of the 20th century, came to the country with the intention of taking it over. Of Judaizing the country. In other words, transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country, transforming Palestine into the land of Israel. And that was the agenda. So in a sense, whether you were on the right or on the left, you had that same political logic. You know, it was the left, you might say, the Labor Party that founded the State of Israel. It was them that did the ethnic cleansing of 1948. That destroyed all the Palestinian villages, drove half the Palestinians out. It was a Labor Party that did the
Nakba for people. I think a lot of people will know, but explain
the Nakba was is the Arab term for what happened in 1948. We call it the War of Independence in Israel. They call it the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And in 1948, there was a concerted campaign to ethnically cleanse the country. Because the country had been partitioned into two states by the UN, a Jewish state and an Arab state. But the Jews were only a third of the population, were newcomers to the country, and yet the UN gave them 56% of the land. Right. And the Palestinian indigenous population only got 42%. So the Palestinians didn't agree, and no colonized people would agree.
No colonized people agree, right.
That 56% of their country would be given to somebody else, and the UN had no authority to give it to the Jews. And there was a war, and in the war, Israel had a concerted campaign of driving the Palestinians out. So about 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of the country. And then, subsequent to that, not in the heat of battle, but after, for 20 years after, Israel systematically destroyed more than 600 entire Palestinian villages, towns, and urban areas in order to, first of all, to take the land, of course, but to prevent the refugees from coming back. So from the very beginning, this was a unilateral process.
Right.
And basically 1967, which was also the Labor Party, was simply the completion of the last stage of the Judaization of the country, where they took the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So the idea of two states, or the idea that these are occupied territories that someday we can negotiate and would become a Palestinian state, was never in the works. It was not part of the logic. The whole logic of the settler colonial movement was unilateral to take the entire country and the indigenous population, who are the Palestinians. Until today in Israel, we don't even use the word Palestinian, because that gives too much distinctiveness and legitimacy to a collective we don't recognize. We talk about Arabs,
right,
in a very general way.
Right.
So that the idea is that the Arabs, the indigenous, have no rights. They have no collective existence, and it's our country exclusively. And so, in a sense, whether it's the right wing or the left wing, Mark Twain grew up on a farm, and he used to say, "My mother was a liberal. She drowned the kittens like everybody else, but she'd warm the water first."
Oh.
So in a sense, the Labor Party,
Right.
warmed the water and talks two states and talks nice and human rights. But in fact, it's actually the Labor Party that conquered the country, that displaced the Palestinians, that conquered the occupied territories. It never agreed to a two-state because Labor was in power during the Oslo peace process. It's Labor that's demolished 55,000 Palestinian homes. It's Labor that built the wall. Likud and Sharon, who was then prime minister, was against building the apartheid wall. It was Labor. So Labor is actually much more responsible for the situation we have today than the Likud.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, I think it was probably oversold in the United States, but I think of who is it, Rivlin, the Likud,
the president of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things he says about just sort of general civility and polity across is
in a country like Israel, it comes out radical.
It sounds radical, and it sounds well to the left of anything that any labor politician says. And even when he made sure to appear with Palestinian children and say, hey, they're your neighbors, you treat them with respect. I mean, this is the type of thing that culturally signifying is well to the left in Israel, and he is in fact a leader of Likud, but a different faction of Likud that has some sense of a broader civic space.
But with no political clout whatsoever.
No political clout whatsoever. So what I want to go to talk about the one state, which relates to it. But first, how did the activism that you had get so specific to home demolition?
Well,
and also explain the home demolition policy.
Right. We were, look, like the Palestinians, the Israeli peace movement, the left, was invested in the Oslo peace process. The sides were
Which
meeting.
began in the 90s.
They began in 1993, lasted for 7 years. And we had hoped that, the sides are meeting and they're negotiating, something would come out. We were doubtful, but there was that hope. And then Rabin was assassinated, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. Netanyahu, who ran against the Oslo peace process, was elected a few months later in early 1996. And we understood that the Oslo peace process was a sham. It's never going to lead to anything. And in fact, the occupation was reasserting itself. Israel was going back. I mean, Israel never stopped demolishing homes. House demolitions that we focus on is really a part of the ethnic cleansing, and it goes on till this moment. So as we, in the left, decided we had to re-engage with resisting the occupation that was coming back in force, we advised with our Palestinian colleagues, what issue should we really focus on that would kind of get to the meat of the oppression or the repression? And the issue of house demolitions came up all the time. This is one of the most painful parts of the occupation, where Israel, not for security reasons, these are not houses of terrorists, which would be the knee-jerk reaction. These are normal people that want to build homes on their own land. Israel has simply frozen Palestinian building in 1967, 50 years ago. So for 50 years, you have kids, your kids have kids, and they have kids, and you want to live somewhere and start a family. Palestinians have not been allowed to build homes for the last 50 years. And when they do, of course, because you have to live somewhere, your homes are demolished. Again, 55,000 Palestinian homes only in the occupied territory since 1967. That's on the backdrop of another 60,000 that were demolished in the Nakba in 1947, 48, and after, and thousands more inside Israel until today. Right. So we're talking about a policy of either inducing emigration of Palestinians, if you don't have a home, or confining them to little tiny islands in the country, which is a kind of an apartheid. Right. So it really is an apartheid instrument.
Right. Actually, before I get to one state, I want to get to this other piece of your work, and correct me if I'm reading it wrong, but one of the things I really like is a part of me really shies away from, and I'm not drawing a false equivalency here. Mm-hmm. One needs to oppose the occupation, period. and the siege on Gaza and everything else. But there's a way in which the conversation about Israel-Palestine becomes very specialized, I think, in a way that robs us of understanding how it fits into a bigger supply chain and a bigger, basically just sort of Western colonial system and a bigger securitization of the world. And so, you know, on one hand, there's, you know, obviously, like some people in my family, which is, well, you know, it's Israel and we have an identity and we can do, you know, we just need to do what we do, which is actually some of my, I think some of the initial critiques I have of identity politics and certain manifestations arise from the tremendous misuse of identity politics in the defense of Israeli apartheid. Then, you know, conversely, I think there are some people who have, you know, it's inevitable that at times there's going to be, if not outright anti-Semitism, shades of anti-Semitism, and a conspiratorial understanding of this. But you've talked about the Israeli government and the occupation and Israelization as really, of course, in and of itself, a horrible, distinct crime, but also a forerunner, almost a horrifying infomercial of a world where Western governments are securitizing borders, where they're policing refugees, where they're detaining
not only Western
all governments. Pardon me. Explain that more sort of security economic supply chain way of understanding the Israeli occupation and how it fits into the bigger picture.
Well, I wrote a book called War Against the People, in which I place really the Israeli, you know, Israel over Palestine is a microcosm of the global North over the global South.
Right. That's why I was saying Western.
And in you know, but we all live in a global capitalist economy.
Right.
I mean, we're all living in the same system, whether you're Western or not Western or Chinese or whatever.
Because for what it's worth, I mean, yeah, in West, in that sense, I realize, yeah, it is sloppy because, I mean, Dubai is Western.
I would talk about capitalist.
Capital.
And everybody's,
that's better.
In one way or another,
Capital.
In the capitalist
Capital
system.
domination and
whether it's
exploitation.
state capitalism like China or, you know, corporate capitalism like here.
Yes, yes.
The point is that in this capitalist system, especially the neoliberal system of the last 50 years, it's closing down more and more. More and more people are excluded. 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 a day. And even, you know, the global South is extending into the global North. You have the Occupy movement here because young children, you know, middle-class kids of the global North are also being excluded. There's no more job security. They can't get housing. You know, they have these huge loans. You know, so they're being excluded. So as the system closes down all over the world and resources are being robbed by corporations, so wars today are resource wars. They're not wars of battles and tanks and ideologies and countries. They're wars against the people. Whether people in the global South that you want to rob and repress because they resist, that's counterinsurgency, or people at home, like middle-class kids or minority kids or immigrants or poor people that also resist being marginalized and impoverished. War against the people.
Ferguson, Occupy.
You can go on and on. I mean,
but just
to
every
fill
day.
In.
Right.
So that wars today are wars against the people. They're fought by police forces and security forces. And the police forces are being militarized. And if you think about it, your militaries are being policified. They're not fighting a war in Afghanistan and Iraq and Africa and so on. They're policing.
Right.
So that all these things are coming together. And in a war against the people, the United States doesn't have the weaponry and tactics because your weapons that the Pentagon develops are geared for fighting the Soviet Union, not for fighting people in Kabul or Brooklyn.
Right.
And Europe hasn't fought colonial wars for decades. So the go-to country, that's what I'm trying to get at, for war against the people is Israel. Because Israel has been fighting a war against the Palestinian people for 125 years. It has an occupied territory that you have to look at as a resource, as a laboratory for testing and perfecting weapons, security systems, surveillance systems, tactics of population control, technologies of repression that are exported. So the point is the Palestinians are the guinea pigs. But you in the United States because Israel is exporting to the United States and all over the world. Israel is the sixth largest arms exporter. So in a sense, you're the end user. You're at the receiving end of the military and policing technologies that are simply perfected on the Palestinians. So it's what I call global Palestine. Right. And we have to understand, and in a sense, it's a great window into understanding how capitalism is enforced. And Israel is really in many, I'm not saying it's the only enforcer, obviously, but Israel really has the model of enforcement and the technologies for it. And even the concept of a security state that it's trying to peddle, that really finds a ready market in this country and all over the world. So Israel really delivers for you. It helps you to repress your own populations. Israel is now being sued by the Khashoggi family, of the journalist that was killed in Istanbul, because the Israelis sold the eavesdropping material to the Saudi government. Right. So whether you want to repress your own people or whether you're a corporation and a corporate government that wants to repress people in general for the interests of global capitalism, Israel becomes the go-to country. So in a sense, there's a global dimension to this conflict, so-called, to the occupation that I think we should all be aware of.
Yeah, this reminds me, I keep thinking, and I'll send it to you if you haven't read it yet, but Achille Mbembe, who's a Cameroonian philosopher, wrote a piece in 2016 called The Age of Humanism is Coming to an End, I believe. And he, in a similar way, he said, basically, Gaza is the microcosm of everything that's happening right now.
That's right. And the point, that's right. And the point that I try to make is that the Gazans, again, are simply the guinea pigs. Yeah. So what I try to say to people is, you should be concerned about Palestinians because they're Palestinians that are suffering for human rights and so on. Right. But in a sense, as you're here in New York or the U.S., as your police forces and security forces are being Israelized, the Jewish Voice for Peace organization has a campaign called Deadly Exchange that's trying to document the Israeli training of American police and arming of American police. As your security forces are being Israelized, you are being Palestinianized, you the people.
Right.
And so in a sense, there's a very real connection between the people on the receiving end in Gaza and the same people on the receiving end of the same weapons and tactics in New York City.
Right. So, and also ideologically too. There's an ideological export and cross-pollination as well.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, Israel is very good at Hasbara, at PR, and so that's, that becomes part of, especially Hasbara of the global capitalist system is around the term security.
Yes. Right.
Because security is kind of a neutral term. Of course I want security, and of course I want my government to give it to me. So it becomes a form of self-pacification where you don't see the political interests involved in pacifying you, in getting you to conform and repressing you and so on, but you simply see it as security, and so you willingly accept it. So to the degree that Israel gets people to accept occupation as something somehow normal, and of course we're defending against occupation because the people of the Palestinians are terrorists, and you make a kind of common sense. Israel is helping, I think, the global elites to package repression as a form of neutral security that, of course, we all
want. How many people after the Snowden revelation said, hey, if you're doing nothing wrong, there's no problem?
Exactly.
Versus looking at the systemic problem of that type of surveillance.
Exactly.
There's two more things I want to touch on with you. So I want to just say, and again, and I like in your work, I mean, of course, there's anti-Semitism in the world, just as there's racism and every other poisonous ism. And I want to bring in the Palestinian political factions, not because, I'm not going to do some silly, but what about Hamas question. Right. But I do want to know how concretely. So when I talk about this, I say, look, here's the reality. The West Bank Palestinian leadership, which are essentially Israeli security subcontractors, are the only political faction that exists right now who have any actual, quote-unquote, power in that they're nominally in charge of the West Bank, but not really. Right. They're the only faction that is totally on board with the 90s Oslo process. They're actually the only ones committed to it. So if you want to believe in that Oslo liberal vision, Mahmoud Abbas should be your guy.
That's right.
100%. Hamas has actually significantly prevaricated on what their position on two states is. They've absolutely committed atrocities. And frankly, they mostly have their hands filled trying to manage an open-air prison where medicine can't get into. Is that a decent frame? I guess what I'm saying is I don't want to – look –
Idealize the Palestinians.
I'm not going to idealize anybody, and also by the same token, look, in a broad sense, I'm not going to. Here's how I see it. Look, I'm not going to pass judgment on how somebody fights their liberation struggle generally. Conversely, if we're going to have values and norms, there's certain tactics and things that just need to be categorically opposed and ruled out, whether they're from the Israelis or Hamas. But that being said, the fundamental point to me is not that I object to criticizing Hamas. I object to any question that has a starting point that we're talking about any type of equivalent power. That, to me, is the enormous dishonesty of that question.
No, there's no symmetry.
Right.
That's why I don't like to use the word conflict.
Right.
The Arab-Israeli conflict.
Right.
Because that assumes both sides.
Right.
We have to negotiate. Whereas settler colonialism is a unilateral process. Israel is not negotiating with the Palestinians, whether it's Abu Mazen or Hamas or anybody.
Right.
And so that we have to, and of course Israel has managed to demonize the Palestinian resistance as terrorism. And of course, the way terrorism is used, it's only applied to non-state actors, not to states. So Israel kills many more civilians and just demolishes homes and conquers and everything than Hamas or any so-called terrorist group. But the word terrorism only sticks to a non-state actor that makes them illegitimate. What we have to do is look at Hamas's actions as resistance. And, in international law, a colonized people has a right to armed resistance.
That being said, but we could still, like using the IRA as an example, so there's no doubt that the IRA needed to be brought into the negotiations that led to Good Friday that approved the situation in Ireland, and they had absolutely the right to resist and every other right that we're talking about. And again, we could still say, hey, you shouldn't have, kneecapped people or planted a bomb in a shopping mall. So that's, I'm trying to make it easier.
Although Israel is never held accountable for doing that.
Well, that goes without
Israel has a whole campaign of what's called targeted assassinations that the U.S. has adopted in different parts of the world. It's routinized, which is illegal in international law, extrajudicial killings. The point is that Hamas is a political organization that's only been demonized by the United States and Israel as a terrorist group. It's denied the political aspects. And Hamas actually agreed to the two-state idea.
Right.
Just like in 2006, all the factions of the Palestinians, from the left to the right, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad, convened in prison because that's where the leadership is. And they came up with what's called the prisoner's document that said all the factions agreed that if Israel would generally give up all the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, which is only 22% of the country, then they would all agree to a peace agreement
for an actual continuous two states within 67 lines. So, but my only point being is that I think it's
just what I'm saying is that Hamas has actually pursued a moderate political line. But in order to avoid all that, Israel has demonized it as an extremist terrorist group.
And I think, they have since they came to power in Gaza, right? Since 2006.
Yeah, I mean, they came to power in an election.
Yeah, they won.
That the United States and Israel unilaterally declared was not legitimate, even though Jimmy Carter was there and said it was a legitimate election.
Right. And we can condemn actions and tactics categorically from anyone as distinct from political delegitimization. Because again, let's face facts here. If you actually generate a solution to this crisis, it's going to involve, like every other diplomatic process, people who essentially, have blood on their hands are going to be part of it. Like Thabo Mbeki says, justice or peace. We opt for peace. He made this point with regards to apartheid. He said, I certainly didn't want the ICC to come in and arrest apartheid leaders. I needed to negotiate with them to end this thing. So the same principle applies. Go talk about one state solution in the final couple minutes. It appeals to me ideologically. I remember I read Tony Judd in the New York Review of Books in college, and I'd said to him, it was like, look, what do I believe in? I believe in a state where everybody, regardless of the background and who they are, has total cultural and individual autonomy, and all is protected under a shared civic law. How could I not support that in the Middle East?
That's right. So what we have today in Israel is the two-state solution is gone. Actually, it never existed. I mean but it's certainly, you can make the case that with the collapse of Oslo for the last 25 years, it's been gone. So for 25 years, we've been floundering, and Israel has simply strengthened its occupation to a degree that today there already is one state.
Right.
Between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, there's only one effective government.
Right.
There's only one army, obviously. There's only one set of borders. In other words, you can't get into the country from any direction without going through Israeli border controls. There's only one currency. There's only one infrastructure. There's only one legal system. So by any measure, this is already one country that Israel created, but it's an apartheid state because you have separate legal regimes for different populations under the same government. So It's like apartheid. It is apartheid. So what we're saying is, okay, it's a fairly stark set of options. The two-state solution that we accepted in the peace camp and the Palestinians accepted is gone or never was. So let's stop talking about it because it's gone. The option, what Israel wants, is apartheid. One country with apartheid that I think all your listeners won't accept. I don't think anybody today would accept apartheid.
Our viewers too,
and your viewers, so that remains. So the third option is to say this: okay, Israel, you created one state. We go along with that. We'll go with the flow. Fine, one state, but it can't be an apartheid regime. It has to be a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens. Now, why there should be such a shocking idea for Americans or people in the West, the democracy.
Right.
That is exactly the way out. It's simple, it cuts through things, and in fact, it would work. Because, it's funny to say this.
Explain how it would work, because I know so many people who are right there, and they still have this little voice. And I say to them, I said, look, look at the transition. Not that South Africa doesn't have plenty of problems, but they generated a full democracy. There's no pogroms. There's no, people participate in politics.
Terrorists, and they predicted
all
bloodbath.
The same stuff.
These are all colonial terms.
Right.
In fact, it sounds funny to say this with occupation and demolitions and repression and wars, but in fact, the country that I'm talking about between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River actually functions not badly today. 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinians.
Right.
There's never been intifadas inside Israel. They're second-class citizens, but they're well integrated in that sense. And even in the occupied territory, before Israel closed the occupied territories almost 30 years ago, so Palestinians don't have access to the Israeli economy anymore and impoverished them. 130,000 Palestinians every day would come into Israel to work. They spoke Hebrew. The last generation of Palestinians was much more integrated into Israel than their kids are, because their kids have been locked out of Israel for the last 30 years. So that, in fact, we had, and we have to some degree, a functioning country. It's true, there's fighting, but a lot of the fighting, like in Gaza, is actually initiated by...
is that Netanyahu?
Take off my coat. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. It's all right.
I didn't think it was going to ring.
It's all right.
I thought the ring was off. And the point I'm trying to make is that the actually the violence, if you want to call it that, or the warfare, has been initiated by Israel. Mm-hmm. The wars, the occupation, the closure of Gaza into like a prison.
Right. I just want to be really clear that when we call Gaza an open-air prison, in the United States, this is
an
still
open-air prison.
First of all, that's an objective fact, and secondly, David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, called it that. So outside of the United States, there is no conversation in mainstream politics about what this is. This is a 2 + 2 = 4 statement.
But the bottom line, all I want to say is that this idea that somehow we're enemies, we'll never live together, we'll kill each other, the Palestinians will kill the Jews, simply isn't true. I think these two peoples actually, there's been a lot of research. Our economies are very complementary. Palestinians have a very vibrant high-tech economy. They're into telecommunications. It's repressed, but it's there. There are more, if you take all the Palestinians in the world and all the Israelis in the world, there are more Palestinians in universities today. They're a highly educated population. They have a tremendously wealthy, educated diaspora behind them that the blacks in South Africa didn't have. So they have resources and they have an interest. What we're trying to do with the one-state idea is to say, let's build a country that's win-win. We're not excluding anybody. We're not destroying anything. We're transforming an apartheid regime into a democratic country in which it's good for everybody. So if you're an Israeli, you can continue to speak Hebrew. Nobody's going to close the Hebrew University. You can live in Hebron if you want to, but the country will be integrated and people will be equal. And in that kind of a situation, the economy will grow, refugees will come back. In that kind of a situation, there's no motivation for bloodshed or one community to attack the other community. It's a win-win for everybody.
Right. And I remember a professor of mine, one of my IR professors, he said, if you look at car theft rings in Israel-Palestine, you could see that even in the worst of times, Israelis and Palestinians can work really well together.
Criminals work very well together.
Yeah, criminals know what they're doing. How can people help and get involved if they're interested, Jeff Halper?
Well, this is a Palestinian-led movement. We call it the One Democratic State Campaign for a single state. It's Palestinians and Israelis, but led, of course, by Palestinians. And we have a Facebook page right now, the One Democratic State Campaign. We're working on a website. We're going to launch this movement probably in April. So we're not all set up yet. We've been spending the last 2 years formulating a program, a 10-point program that I think is a very good program, which you can find on the Facebook page. And then people can contact me or contact us through the Facebook page. We have an email which is contact@onedemocraticstate.org, and we're at the ground level right now. So people want to get involved. This is the time.
ground up, not the Howard Schultz one. The good one. Jeffrey Halper.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.